Debate review. Does the biblical God exist? Opening statements. I recently watched the Does the Biblical God Exist debate featuring Alex O'Connor and Phil Harper on one side and Cliffe and Stuart on the other, presented by Modern Day Debate. The event was, to say the least, a chaotic and awkward engagement for all participants. The moderator, whom I've seen both excel and falter as a host in previous debates, was all but absent this showing. The moderator was mostly passive and allowed the discussion to spiral off topic and unravel into disarray, stepping in only sporadically to address time constraints. The most coherent and structured portion of the debate was the opening statements, a brief moment of order amidst the broader confusion. However, even these initial presentations were riddled with digressions and rhetorical distractions. The debate commenced with Stuart taking the affirmative. His primary argument for the existence of God revolved around the concept of moral obligation, encapsulated by the notions of oughts and shoulds. He further asserted that suffering in all its magnitude cannot be merely purposeless, citing Friedrich Nietzsche as a surprising ally in recognizing the utility of a belief in God. Stuart's secondary argument, however, was markedly less convincing. He posited that the prevalence of stories with beginnings and linear chronologies in fiction and entertainment somehow substantiates the existence of the biblical God. The logical connection here was tenuous at best. He concluded his opening by claiming that belief in God is supported by the universal life experiences of all living creatures, with particular emphasis on humanity. Cliffe followed, also arguing in the affirmative. His line of reasoning was more traditional. He asserted that non-existence cannot produce existence, chaos cannot produce order, and that abstract phenomena such as love and free will cannot originate from mere matter. Cliffe's ultimate proof of God was rooted in the life and existence of Jesus Christ. Additionally, he contended that pride is the sole reason for rejecting belief in God, and dismissed axiomatic morality as mere relativism, which, for him, was fundamentally unworkable. Phil Harper then spoke, taking the negative position. His arguments against the existence of God included the problem of animal suffering, the concept of the firmament, alleged errors in the Bible, particularly in Genesis, and the purported decline of the Big Bang theory's acceptance among scientists. He also cited fine-tuning arguments, questioned the plausibility of Christianity's exclusive truth claims, and invoked the possibility of a multiverse as a counterpoint. However, this barrage of objections, akin to a mini Gish Gallop, lacked coherence and ultimately failed to substantiate his claim. Even if all of his points were valid, they would not necessarily disprove the existence of God. Rather, they might challenge specific Christian interpretations of God's nature or character. In this sense, Phil's critique was more a refutation of certain theological perspectives than an effective negation of biblical-based theism. Then Alex O'Connor presented his case against God's existence. He opened with the principle that from the false, anything follows, suggesting that if foundational premises about God are flawed, all derivative claims collapse. He expressed doubt about the consistency between the Old Testament depiction of God and the character of Jesus in the New Testament. He also raised concerns about discrepancies between Old Testament prophecies and their alleged New Testament fulfillments, such as prophecies claimed to be fulfilled in the New Testament that simply don't exist as verses in the Old Testament, as well as apparent contradictions within the Gospels themselves. For example, he pointed to the differences in the accounts of Jesus' last words, arguing that such inconsistencies undermine the Bible's reliability as a source of truth about God. Alex further questioned the moral and theological implications of animal suffering, noting that animals, which lack free will and moral agency, still endure pain. He deemed this troubling if one assumes a benevolent and omnipotent deity. He also mentioned the regionality problem of belief, the observation that religious convictions often correlate with geographic and cultural factors, though he left this argument underdeveloped. Finally, Alex expressed confusion over the concept of the biblical God, citing the diversity of interpretations within Christianity itself as a barrier to belief. Ultimately, his objections, while earnest, seemed to rest more on skepticism and doubt than on a cohesive argument against the biblical God's existence. This debate, though ostensibly focused on the existence of the biblical God, devolved into a fragmented series of assertions and counter-assertions. Each participant's performance reflected a lack of engagement with the core question and an over-reliance on tangential or poorly developed arguments. The result was an unstructured and unsatisfying discussion that illuminated less about the existence of God and more about the pitfalls of unfocused debate, preparation, and moderation. The open dialogue begins. The open dialogue portion of the debate began with Stuart once again taking the lead. He opened with a factoid, citing an article in Nature magazine that claimed 40% of Harvard medical students and resident philosophers believe in a personal God. While this statistic, if true, is intriguing, it is largely irrelevant to the central question of whether a God exists, and even more so to the specific inquiry of whether the God of the Bible exists. These theists, after all, could believe in any number of deities, not necessarily the one described in the biblical narratives. Stuart further argued that this statistic is particularly noteworthy because, in his opinion, Nature is a highly secular and atheistic publication. However, this assertion is subjective and tangential to the debate's core issues. Stuart then pivoted to an unrelated question, asking, why are most atheists white males? This appeared to be an attempt at levity, or perhaps a preemptive response to Alex's anticipated arguments about regionalism. However, the question was left unexplored, and Stuart quickly shifted gears to call David Hume an idiot. He dismissed the objections raised against God's existence during the debate as genetic fallacies, arguing that greater exposure to the concept of God does not necessarily lead to belief. To support this, he referenced a poll claiming that 75% of pastors' children reject God and never return to religion, whereas he himself did. Stuart then veered into a series of non sequiturs and factoids, asserting that cultural evidence does not lead to conversion or acceptance of faith. He concluded this segment by appealing to famous atheists' purported inability to convincingly refute the theological argument, and by lamenting the perceived moving of the goalpost regarding what evidence would suffice to convince atheists as a whole of God's existence, particularly in the case of miracles. Phil Harper responded by accusing Stuart of cherry-picking. A more accurate characterization of Stuart's approach, however, might be a shotgun strategy, presenting an array of defenses against potential objections without properly framing them or connecting them to the broader topic of the debate. Alex O'Connor then contributed his thoughts, introducing the principle that the exception to the rule does not disprove the rule. He assumed that God would desire to make himself equally known to everyone, but he neither explained the basis for this assumption nor provided evidence for its validity. Alex's arguments about regionalism and faith revealed an inconsistent double standard, which undermined the coherence of his position. When responding to Phil and Alex's objections, Stuart descended into a convoluted series of poorly formulated follow-up questions. This rhetorical detour cast further doubt on the relevance and validity of his earlier claims, as he failed to address the central question: does a God of any kind exist? Alex then provided what should have been Stuart's answer to an earlier point, paradoxically, using it to argue against divine providence. In doing so, Alex inadvertently delivered a proper Christian response to his and Phil's objections, demonstrating that he understood both the questions and the standard answers better than the Clinically duo. Stuart called Alex out on this, and Alex seemed momentarily taken aback, struggling to reconcile his belief with the depth of his own theological understanding. This moment forced Alex into a verbal retreat, leading him to present a Catholic argument that he visibly recognized as incompatible with his stated position. His visible discomfort and contorted expressions hinted at an internal struggle, which culminated in an attempt to shift the discussion toward doctrinal issues. He argued that if the Clinicles accepted his reasoning, they would lack a consistent doctrine and should just admit that they are now universalist when it comes to salvation, a claim that Stuart's sloppy Protestant framing had inadvertently reinforced. Stuart's insistence on a Protestant perspective further complicated the exchange. Alex, whose studies had moved him beyond Protestantism in his intellectual rejection of theism and Christianity, was forced to engage with outdated arguments. This misalignment caused Alex to rely on rhetorical scripts he had not revisited in years, leading to moments of incoherence. As Alex's arguments devolved into word salad, he accused Stuart of making claims that Stuart had explicitly disavowed. Although this misstep weakened Alex's position, Stuart's poor performance up to that point likely obscured this error for much of the audience. Analysis of the continuing open dialogue. Cliffe intervened in an attempt to rectify the inaccuracies and missteps made by both his son and Alex O'Connor. Unfortunately, his effort was undermined by the weight of Orthodox rabbinical Jewish commentary and the insights of modern secular academic scholarship on the Old Testament, particularly Genesis. When these critiques were brought to light, Cliffe pivoted to the New Testament, acknowledging its diverse perspectives and interpretations. However, he stopped short of labeling these as contradictions. This maneuver seemed to rely on semantic equivocation, a rhetorical strategy that has grown tiresome over the last 2 decades of debates between atheists and Christians. It underscores the urgent need for a consensus on the precise definitions of terms used in such discussions, or, more realistically, a disciplined avoidance of vague language by both parties. Cliffe's critique of hyperskepticism as a flawed interpretive framework was valid and compelling. Regrettably, this strong point was followed by a fallacious emotional appeal. Diluting its impact, he then revisited his worldview argument, which predictably failed to resonate with his opponents. In an ironic twist, Cliffe countered the earlier atheist argument about animal suffering, which was an emotional appeal, with an emotional appeal of his own, demonstrating a lack of consistency in his rhetorical strategy. He further complicated matters by asserting that Christian mythos development, which occurred later in history, is somehow reflected in Old Testament Jewish scripture. While he may have been attempting to invoke typology, his execution was muddled and ineffective. This misstep led Alex to interrupt, rightly cutting off what had devolved into apologetical rhetoric. Phil, in his turn, advanced an argument centered on the biblical descriptions of the firmament. He noted that rabbis once believed it to be a literal structure and inferred that this implies the Bible is describing science. This assertion, however, represents an egregious anachronism. Science, as we understand the term today, did not exist in the cultural and historical context in which these biblical passages were written. Phil's reasoning here stretched credulity to its breaking point. In response, Cliffe floundered, echoing Alex's earlier struggle. His desperate search for an adequate counter-argument resulted in a meandering discourse, filled with word salad and emotional berating. This poor showing undermined his earlier arguments and led him to contradict positions he had previously defended in this same debate. In attempting to repudiate traditional biblical interpretations that have been orthodox for millennia, Cliffe exposed a troubling ignorance of historical and theological context. His mishandling of the Galileo controversy, for instance, erroneously framing it as a uniquely Catholic issue rather than a broader Christian one. Cliffe's willingness to dismiss the historical consensus and traditional interpretations of the Bible as false, merely to counter Phil's claims, came across as opportunistic and deeply unreliable. Such a mercenary approach casts doubt on the credibility of his apologetics and suggests a troubling readiness to distort biblical teachings for rhetorical convenience. Alex seized the opportunity created by this mistake to press Cliffe on his inconsistencies, asking whether he would adopt a similar approach to the Quran. Alex pointed out that by Cliffe's logic, the Bible's textual variations, such as the additions and omissions surrounding the story of the woman caught in adultery, would undermine its reliability as well. This pointed question exposed further cracks in Cliffe's argument. Cliffe's response was evasive and disingenuous, attempting to redirect the conversation toward the broader topic of biblical reliability. This pivot failed to address the substantive issues raised and only deepened the impression of rhetorical weakness and conceptual incoherence. Overall, Cliffe's performance in this segment was marked by contradictions, evasion, and a lack of intellectual rigor, severely undermining his apologetic credibility. Escalation of the debate. Alex turned the attempted topic change back on Cliffe, posing the same question about textual inconsistencies, and Cliffe, unprepared, admitted that he did not know the answer. Stuart interjected, dismissing the entire line of questioning as nonsensical. He then made a bold and demonstrably false claim that the Bible, particularly the New Testament, did not originate from tradition, but instead from direct eyewitness testimony. This assertion was met with incredulity, as it flies in the face of well-documented historical scholarship. Cliffe, visibly frustrated, began accusing Alex of making claims he had not actually stated. Attempting to regain control, Cliffe shifted the discussion to the questions of what is most reasonable and reliable, positing that supernatural explanations are inherently more probable than naturalistic ones. In doing so, he conflated materialism with a denial of truth, rather than addressing the substantive challenges raised by Phil and Alex. Seizing on Cliffe's pivot, Alex posed a series of incisive questions. He inquired whether individuals other than Jesus or those he purportedly resurrected had ever risen from the dead. Alex also referenced the great zombie apocalypse described at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, a narrative often cited as perplexing within biblical scholarship. Cliffe squandered this opportunity to provide a thoughtful response, instead countering with a deflection. What alternative explanation is more reliable than God or Christ? As Cliffe's frustration mounted, he peppered Alex with questions about his motivations. Alex, maintaining his composure, responded that he did not know the ultimate answers to these questions, and more importantly, that he did not care. This response, while ostensibly nonchalant, was undercut by Alex's active participation in many of these kind of debates, rendering his statement both insincere and unconvincing. Alex then compounded his position by conflating literary conventions and expressions with historical claims, a misstep that Cliffe failed to exploit due to his own philosophical illiteracy. Instead of capitalizing on Alex's error, Cliffe attempted to psychoanalyze Alex's intentions. In a misguided rhetorical flourish, he presented a false dichotomy between hope and despair, castigating Alex's agnosticism as untenable. Cliffe erroneously argued that agnosticism was incompatible with valuing life, asserting that death and funerals compel individuals to confront the possibility of eternal life. This tactic was not only a gross oversimplification, but also a strategic blunder of significant proportions. At this point, the debate's moderator prompted Phil to redirect the conversation back to the central question at hand. Does the God of the Bible exist? Philip lamented that so much of the discussion thus far had been tangential to the core topic. Ironically, he followed this approach with his own emotionally charged inquiry about animal suffering. Turning to Stuart, Philip asked whether the earlier Nature magazine statistics Stuart cited would not, by the same logic, be a reason to doubt God's existence if the majority of Harvard's intellectual elite were non-believers. Stuart's response was telling. He became visibly upset, and rather than addressing the question directly, raised a rhetorical flourish, asking what the justification was for killing animals among non-believers. He then appealed to an ultra-literal interpretation of Isaiah, suggesting that in heaven the lion will lie with the lamb. By treating this poetic imagery as a concrete prophecy, Stuart showcased a troubling lack of interpretive nuance. He compounded this error by invoking the authority of C.S. Lewis and citing well-known authors who converted from atheism to Christianity as though their personal journeys constituted evidence for the existence of God. This line of reasoning, while rhetorically appealing, is fundamentally flawed. The belief in something does not serve as proof of its truth. Stuart's handling of the problem of animal suffering was equally inadequate. In an attempt to appear clever, he invoked a type of outdated relativism that failed to address the issue substantively. This rhetorical misstep further eroded the credibility of the father-son apologetics team, leaving the opponents unconvinced and the central question of the debate unresolved. The debate deteriorates. At the 1 hour, 16-minute mark, the debate took a decisive turn for the worse, descending into an incoherent exchange of arguments and rhetorical posturing. Amid the verbal chaos, the most coherent thread emerged in the form of an argument about whether a certain level of suffering constitutes a moral indictment on reality itself. Philip raised a provocative question. If torturing animals is not enough to show that the God of the Bible is not perfectly good, then what would be? What could convince you that God isn't good? While the question carried emotional weight, it strayed far from the debate's titular focus, whether the God described in the Bible exists. Alex skillfully turned this question against Cliffe, invoking Cliffe's own standard that "I don't know" was not an acceptable answer. He then posed a sardonic query. Would you rather kill yourself than be an animal? Without giving Cliffe a chance to respond, answered his own question with a resounding yes, a move clearly designed to unsettle his opponent. Cliffe, visibly shaken, responded by asserting that his concerns were broader than the suffering of animals. However, as his emotions escalated, the coherence of his argument diminished. He veered into the realm of hyperbole, claiming that atheism could only lead to despair, and even suggesting that the devil might be to blame for such existential hopelessness. When this argument failed to gain traction, Cliffe attempted to pivot yet again, but his refusal to assign clear responsibility for the current state of reality only justified the opponent's skepticism of his grasp of the topic. In response, Philip reframed the question, presenting it as a binary choice. Either suffering is acceptable and thus moral, or it is unacceptable and thus immoral. This framing, while rhetorically compelling, constituted a false dichotomy by assuming that violence and suffering must always be morally wrong. Moreover, this line of inquiry remained tangential to the core question of the debate. Alex, undeterred, brought the discussion back to the subject of biblical theology. He posed a more incisive query. If suffering and evil entered the world through Adam's sin, then how do you explain the suffering of non-human animals that predate Homo sapiens by millions of years? This question implicitly challenged the coherence of Cliffe's theological framework. Alex then added another sardonic jab, warning Cliffe that another "I don't know" response would amount to an admission of agnosticism. Predictably, Cliffe admitted that he indeed did not know, unwittingly undermining the authoritative stance he had maintained throughout most of the debate. He further claimed that asserting knowledge of such matters was the height of human arrogance, seemingly oblivious to how this concession contradicted his earlier declarations. In an ill-conceived attempt to regain control, Cliffe implicated Alex subtly, accusing him of being a secret believer in coded language, a baseless and desperate ploy to force a confession of faith. Philip seized upon Cliffe's disarray, interpreting his statements through Cliffe's own standards and exposing their inconsistency. Cliffe's retort was a single word, false, followed by a disjointed theological assertion that God created three autonomous beings to live in harmony and love. This response lacked coherence and further eroded his credibility. He never stated who these three beings were or when they were created. Philip then introduced the concept of redundancy and backups in divine planning, arguing that if Cliffe's interpretation were correct, then God's plan appeared fundamentally flawed. He suggested that the absence of contingency measures rendered the plan inadequate. Ironically, Philip overlooked a critical point. In Christian theology, Jesus is often considered the ultimate contingency plan. However, Cliffe failed to articulate this, leaving the argument and this engagement unresolved. As the debate spiraled further into confusion, the initial question of whether the God of the Bible exists receded into the background, overshadowed by tangential disputes and rhetorical missteps on all sides. The debate's chaotic conclusion. By the time the debate reached its final segment, it had devolved into outright proselytizing and personal attacks. Cliffe, appearing frustrated and out of his depth, resorted to evangelizing, abandoning any pretense of engaging with the intellectual challenges presented by Alex and Philip. Stuart joined in, attempting to defend his father, but only managing to reveal his own inability to grasp the central issues. Phil, seeing an opening, appealed to alternative philosophies and religious worldviews, only to have Cliffe dismiss them arrogantly and ignorantly out of hand. Alex, observing the disarray, aptly remarked, "This is getting ludicrous." He pointed out that numerous philosophies and religions had addressed the suffering of animals long before Christianity emerged as a practiced faith. Pivoting to the crux of his critique, Alex emphatically reiterated, "We are talking about the suffering before the fall of man." His challenge underscored a significant theological inconsistency. If animal suffering predates humanity's fall, how could it logically be a consequence of that event? Well, Alex did not acknowledge alternative explanations, such as divine timelessness, or theological theories involving non-linear time, his argument most likely resonated with those in the broader audience who accept conventional chronology and logic. At this point, Alex's frustration boiled over. He accused Cliffe of intellectual dishonesty and defended his own integrity, declaring, "I might be wrong. I might even be stupid, but I am not being dishonest about my doubts." This impassioned defense highlighted Alex's commitment to intellectual transparency, contrasting sharply with what he perceived as Cliffe's evasiveness. Both Cliffe and Stuart offered apologies, but the damage had already been done. The conversation, now thoroughly derailed, showed no signs of returning to the original debate question. Cliffe, in a final attempt to regain control, introduced a new cosmology involving chaos and the Spirit of God, suggesting that the rebellion of Lucifer and the demons had occurred long before humanity's creation. While this narrative might have offered an intriguing theological perspective, Cliffe's inability to present it coherently rendered it ineffective. He compounded his missteps by asserting that true agnosticism was impossible, claiming that one's actions and decisions inevitably reveal belief. While this argument had philosophical merit, its relevance to the debate was tenuous at best. Phil attempted to call out Cliffe's assumptions, accusing him of begging the question and relying on emotional manipulation rather than reasoned argument. This critique was not without merit. Cliffe's increasingly emotive appeals made the later portion of the debate uncomfortable to watch. Although the Q&A session that followed offered a momentary reprieve from the chaos, it failed to produce any substantive or memorable contributions. My conclusion. In the end, this debate was far from the worst in recent history, but it did little to enhance the reputations of its participants. Cliffe and Stuart came across as unprepared and unable to address the intellectual challenges posed by their opponents. Their arguments often seemed reactionary, lacking the depth and rigor required for a debate of this nature. Alex, while rhetorically sharp, occasionally veered into bad faith arguments and displayed a callous demeanor that detracted from his otherwise strong performance. Philip, though more measured, struggled to maintain focus on the debate's central question. Ultimately, the debate failed to adequately address its titular question: does the God of the Bible exist? Cliffe and Stuart's lack of theological and philosophical sophistication prevented them from presenting a compelling case. Meanwhile, Alex and Phil's incisive critiques, while effective at dismantling their opponent's arguments, did not build a coherent countercase for atheism or agnosticism or against the existence of the biblical God. The result was a debate that felt more like a missed opportunity than a meaningful exchange of ideas. For this reason, this debate earns a middling score, 2 out of 5 or 4 out of 10. This debate serves as a reminder that a debate's success depends not only on the participants' knowledge, but also on their ability to engage respectfully and thoughtfully with the other's perspectives. Thank you and good night.